meat was a dear product in the Soviet Union at the time. And so I find in the archives a manual for meat packers. And it said, take the meat and grade it low, medium, and high levels of radiation. The low and the medium levels mix together with clean meat and make sausage. And send it all, package it and label it as you normally would, send it all over the Soviet Union. Just don't send any to Moscow.
Hello, everyone. What a great audience we have tonight. Welcome, everyone, to the Lowell Humanities Series, the 5th event of the fall semester, and part of a tradition stretching all the way back to 1957. My name is Nicole Eaton. I'm a professor here in the History Department at BC, and tonight I have the pleasure of introducing the esteemed historian Kate Brown, who will be presenting to us tonight on the topic, The Interminable Cycles of Chernobyl's Catastrophe, War, Accident, and War Again. Professor Kate Brown teaches at MIT here across the river, where she is the Thomas M. Siebel Distinguished Professor in the History of Science. She is the author of numerous award-winning works of history, including 3 historical monographs, numerous articles, and a published collection of essays. I'll go into more detail about those in just a second. She also serves, very importantly, as consulting editor for the American Historical Review, which is the journal of record for history in the United States, and the senior editor for the journal International Labor and Working Class History. Professor Brown's research has been supported by numerous fellowships and grants from Guggenheim Foundation, Carnegie, European University Institute, Kennan Institute, Harvard's Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the International Research and Exchanges Board, and the Social Science Research Foundations. I am not going to name all of her book prizes because that would be an even longer list. So imagine that you can go and look those up. That long list of awards and associations gives you a sense of Kate Brown's prestige in the field of history, but I want to explain also the importance of her works because they have been truly path-breaking in different ways and have left a lasting mark on the way many of us write and think about history. Kate Brown was trained in Soviet and Eurasian history, a sort of area studies field, but her research and writing extends far beyond that region, both methodologically and geographically, to far broader scopes and more universal themes. She has written these 4 books on topics ranging from population politics, linguistic mapping, the production of nuclear weapons and the nuclear cities that grew up around them, the health and environmental consequences of nuclear fallout from Chernobyl. We're going to hear more about that tonight. And then also, as I mentioned, narrative innovations in history writing. Professor Brown's research interests, in her own words, illuminate the point where history, science, technology, and biopolitics converge to create large-scale disasters and modernist wastelands. And so I'm very excited to welcome Professor Brown tonight on her talk about Chernobyl and war and the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so without further ado, please, Professor Brown.
Well, I want to thank you, Professor Eaton, for that introduction, and thanks for all the help I've had in organizing tonight's event, and thanks for coming tonight. It's a beautiful evening, it'd be a great evening for a walk, so I appreciate that you have come here. And I want to talk a little bit about how the war in Ukraine has sort of given us a new scope on nuclear energy. Both sort of military nuclear energy and civilian, and for decades, nuclear engineers and policy specialists have been very careful to make a distinction between the peaceful atom and the martial atom, and the two. It was a Cold War strategy to assert that one's own reactors delivered peace and prosperity, not war and destruction. Here's that's what on top of that building there in the city where the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, Pripyat, is. It says, in Ukrainian, let the atom be a worker, not a soldier. And of course, President Eisenhower famously unveiled the Atoms for Peace program in 1953, as part of this sort of propaganda effort to claim a peaceful atom after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I think the war in Ukraine has exhibited in full glory a very different story. It has shown how easy it is to weaponize a nuclear reactor, how simple it is to use a nuclear power plant and nuclear waste facility as nuclear terrorism, and how ill-prepared the world's nuclear regulatory agencies have been in predicting and preparing for this scenario. In February 2022, the Russian army entered Ukraine from Belarus, going through the shared Belarusian-Ukrainian Chernobyl zone. It was a soft border, easy to get in. Long convoys of trucks passed through the site and the larger zone, kicking up a lot of dust. And as they did that, all these radiation monitors went bing, 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 bing. There was these automatic monitors. You could watch them on the web. And they started going off crazily in those first days of war. And then all of a sudden, as these monitors, the radiation levels spiked, then the monitors went dead, turned off. Then Russian generals, the Russian army's going in, Russian generals ordered Russian soldiers to camp out in the most radioactive part of the Chernobyl zone. That's the Red Forest. It took the hardest hit of radiation right after the accident. And they dug trenches there. And they made their homes there for a full month. And this is a place where the daily dose surpasses the annual threshold for nuclear workers. So each day they were getting way too much radiation. A few weeks later, the Russian army made a beeline for the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant south in Ukraine. And in both cases, as the Russian army invaded, the Ukrainian security forces and Ukrainian army stepped down to avert the disaster of missiles, conventional missiles landing on reactors or basins filled with radioactive fuel. The public learned that no nuclear regulatory agency, not the UN, not the Americans or the British, had ever stress-tested reactor containment structures for a direct hit from a conventional missile or artillery. Cooling basins holding decades of highly radioactive fuel had no containment or protection at all. They're just like big box warehouses. We learned with the war in Ukraine that nuclear engineers and nuclear policy experts had not imagined in their emergency planning scenarios something so mundane and something so human as warfare. After a month in the Red Forest, reportedly some Russian soldiers fell ill, and after that the Russian army withdrew from the Chernobyl zone. And I think the carelessness with which Russian generals operated in the Chernobyl zone is an outgrowth of a great deal of mistruths and half-truths told after the accident that continue up until this day. Had the Russian generals known about the Red Forest, had they known that prevailing winds from a nuclear explosion in Ukraine traditionally go northeast towards the big Russian cities, they might have acted with more caution as they use these sites as places for sort of nuclear terrorism. So the ignorance I found working on this book about Chernobyl is an outgrowth of the Chernobyl accident, how knowledge of the impact of a colossal release of radioactive energy from 50 to 200 million curies of radioactivity was swept away in the decades following the 1986 explosion of reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in northern Ukraine. So I want to tell you tonight what I learned working my way through 27 archives in the former Soviet Union and in the UN family of organizations about the medical and environmental effects of the Chernobyl accident. I assume you can watch the HBO show to get the blow-by-blow of the accident itself, but I didn't really care about that. I wanted to know how the outcome of the accident worked, and I want to talk to you tonight about how that outcome intertwines civilian nuclear power plants with the Marshall atom, with nuclear weapons itself, and how the two are very hard to pull apart, despite decades of propaganda telling us otherwise. So within 36, let me just tell you a little bit about the accident. Within 36 hours of the explosion, of two explosions at the reactor, Soviet officials drew a 30-kilometer circle around the plant and declared it the zone of alienation. Over the course of the next few weeks, they resettled about 120,000 people from this zone. And then Moscow leaders said, that the accident was safely contained within this Chernobyl zone, and everything was okay outside of it. But I found some interesting records that pointed to a deliberate contamination outside the zone. A few days after the accident, a storm front was brewing with powerful winds that were going to blow that front northeast towards Voronezh, Yaroslavl, and Moscow. Millions of Russian citizens living in them. So pilots went up from Moscow, flew to Chernobyl, and followed those storm clouds and manipulated the weather to let radioactive rain fall on rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. And here's a map. You see over in the bottom, that's the Chernobyl zone, angry red spots, high levels of radioactivity. And then you see that the pilots held off as they flew over the big city of Gomel, about 500,000 people, and then it let it rain on the Mogilov province, about 200,000 farmers living there, where you see that second set of red spots, nearly as radioactive as right at ground zero of the accident. Now, this was a triage operation, 200,000 versus millions in those Russian cities. The only problem is they didn't tell anyone in Belarus that they had done this, not even the head of the Belarusian Communist Party. For the second Chernobyl zone, people lived there. It was not evacuated in those red-hot zones until 1999. So people lived there for 14 years, exposed to high levels of exposure. And we'll learn more about those people as I go on. Another narrative is that the Soviets said they told their citizens that they tested the food and they found it safe. Working my way through the Ministry of Agriculture records, I found vectors of contaminated food spreading especially where humans congregated. Animals grazing under radioactive clouds were severely hit. About 100,000 head of livestock were unwell. They were losing their hair, they had burns, they were weak. And so the order came out to round up 100,000 head of livestock and slaughter them. And then they didn't know what to do with it. Meat was a dear product in the Soviet Union at the time. And so I find in the archives a manual for meat packers. And it said, take the meat and grade it low, medium, and high levels of radiation. The low and the medium levels mix together with clean meat and make sausage. And send it all, package it and label it as you normally would, send it all over the Soviet Union. Just don't send any to Moscow. You can tell where the meat packers lived. And then the high-level meat, take that meat and shove it in some freezers and wait for it to decay. Well, pretty quickly in that city of Gomel and some northern Ukrainian cities, the requests came in, we need more freezers. They had obviously a lot of high-level meat. They keep asking for freezers. They're not getting enough freezers. So finally in Gomel, they find a refrigerated train car, and they shoved in 60 tons of high-level radioactive meat. And they sent that train to Baku. In Baku, the Geiger counters went off, so they sent it to Yerevan in Armenia, and so on and so on. This radioactive ghost train circulated the western half of the Soviet Union for 4 years, until the Ukrainian KGB finally buried it and its rotting meat inside the Chernobyl zone, where it should have gone in the first place. that radioactive meat was not unique. In that second Chernobyl zone in the Mogilev province, 3/4 of milk was over permissible levels. In 1987, 22% of all mother's milk had higher than permissible levels. So, I could see also another narrative is that from this, map of radiation, it didn't really make sense to me. There were hot spots of health problems occurred not just in the red zones on this map, but in places with low levels of radiation, where no one expected to see problems. In one case, in the town of Chernihiv, there, you see a pretty clean area with, sort of off-white color. 200 wool workers were granted liquidator status. Now, liquidators were people who got subsidies for food and housing because they had documented exposures of Chernobyl contaminants. Now, how did that happen? In my mind, liquidators were the firemen who were, fought the radioactive flames in the weeks and months after the accident. They were not women textile workers sorting wool 50 miles away. So I dug around the archives. I didn't find a whole lot. So I decided with a research assistant, Olya Martinyuk, we got in the rental car and we drove to Chernihiv. And at first we interviewed the factory managers, and they said, yeah, we had a small problem in 1986. And then this commission come from Moscow and we fixed it and everything was fine. But I've over the years have talked to a lot of people in management, and I find that sometimes they don't always tell me the truth. And so I said, well, can I go down to the line and see what the factory looks like? And they said, sure, go on down. And there I met these women. Their job is to sort wool by categories of wool. And I had this list of 200 liquidators, and they're picking out their names from the list. There I am. There, and there was only 10 of them around. And I said, well, where's everybody else? And they said, oh, they've either died or been pensioned out as invalids. As I sniffed around in the local archives, I found that just in sorting wool on these tables, these women were getting 3.2 microroentgen an hour. That's like hugging an X-ray machine while it's turned on and doing that over and over again. Now, these women had no more than a high school degree, yet I was impressed by their knowledge of radiobiology. They pointed to different parts of their bodies that ached or were diseased, and they could relate accurately which radioactive isotopes were lodged in which organ. They knew where the factory's radioactive waste went. They were like, sure, we could get this wool clean, but what do you think happened to the wastewater that left the plant? And I said, I don't know. They said, well, it went into a drinking water reservoir. I didn't really believe that, but again, in the local archives, that story turned out to be true. So I could tell from the archival records that workers remembered better and knew more than the managers related to me. So here's one last confusing story. Soviet leaders said that they gave medical exams to 900,000 people and that they saw no change in health statistics. They said that they had 300 hospitalizations. These were mostly plant operators and emergency workers hospitalized right after the accident. And if you watch that HBO show, you see some graphic stories about people with acute radiation sickness. But with 2 research assistants, we went through health and hospital records down to the county level. And we counted not 300 people hospitalized, but 44,000 people hospitalized just in the summer after the accident, 11,000 of whom were children. And records show that immediately after the accidents, doctors treated sick children and sick adults. They recorded from 1986 an increase in thyroid problems, complications in birth, birth defects, and infant mortality. Children and pregnant women were especially hard hit. In 1987, in contaminated regions, half of all children had enlarged thyroids. Babies born with birth defects doubled. Perinatal deaths within 10 days of birth, doubled in 1987 and tripled in 1988. In one county of 103 babies, 63 were born alive. Among adults, cases of heart disease, enlarged thyroids, gastrointestinal and urinary tract disorders doubled or tripled between 1986 and 1988. Cancer rates in Belarus climbed between 86 and 89, 5 times higher in that second Chernobyl zone than in the rest of Belarus as a whole. And so here's a couple of people, a man and a boy who are post-op from thyroid cancer surgery. And here's a couple of visualizations. These are the kind of documents I'm finding in the archives. This document says that of 1,551 children in this particular county, 1,132 have one chronic disease or another. 80% of the kids were sick with something, and 20% were deemed healthy by the local, health officials. That was a Soviet term, healthy. This was a flip from pre-1986, where 80% of the kids would be healthy and 20 would have some disease or another. This is another chart. This shows kids with pernicious anemia, and you can see this, arrow is just sort of like a spike going off to infinity. The simple questions of fatalities is difficult to answer. UN websites give the number of between 36 and 54 people dead from Chernobyl. A UN project in 2004 report projected 4,000 to 9,000 cancer deaths in the future caused by Chernobyl contaminants. Greenpeace projected 90,000 people would die from Chernobyl. And the lower numbers, 36, 54, are commonly cited by the Washington Post, the Boston Globe. And I wondered about that. You travel around northern Ukraine, southern Belarus, and you meet an awful lot of people who claim that their family members have died from Chernobyl. In Ukraine alone, 35,000 women receive compensation because their husbands have died from a Chernobyl-related illness. Now, that's just men dying who were married and old enough to get married. That doesn't count women and children. In Ukraine, off the record in 2016, officials told me that they estimate about 150,000 Ukrainians had died by that time of Chernobyl-related exposures. Now, that's just Ukraine. It only received 20% of Chernobyl contaminants. 80% went to to southern Belarus and western Russia. Those countries published no statistics at all that we could find about health effects from Chernobyl. Nothing of the kind. So we have a big gap in that knowledge. So I worked to sort out this confusing record. Who was right? Was there really a public health disaster involving 4 million people that we know almost nothing about? And I just couldn't believe that. How could a public health problem exist at that scale? How could that slip beneath the radar? The textual records I was looking at had contradictions and conflicting measurements, plus some strange occurrences. In the summer of 1990, just when some UN inspectors were coming in, hard drives from 4 Soviet computers, they're the only computers that had unique data on doses residents received, were stolen, and they've never been recovered. I found in archives that Soviet officials falsified accounts, while KGB agents planted fake news in the press. I also noticed that consultants for UN agencies disappeared evidence and dismissed about half of the research sent to them from Soviet researchers on the ground in the Chernobyl zone. Now, I was writing this in 2015-16, and I was thinking of the WikiLeaks scandal and the 2016 elections, and I grasped that information in archives could have been planted there for someone like me to find later. People lie, so therefore archives lie, and I was thinking to myself, how am I going to fact check this story? So seeking to find sources that were more reliable, I thought, what about the landscape? People lie, but trees don't, or do they? And so I called up a forester because I wanted to get, an understanding of the local ecology of this place. And one thing to understand about the Chernobyl zone is that the Chernobyl plant was put in Europe's largest swamp called the Pripyat Marshes. It's an absolutely astounding ecosystem. It's a big sandy bowl transected by 17 rivers that break up into hundreds of streams and bogs and swamps and lakes. Now, one thing that reactors need is a lot of water. And so in the 1970s, when they're siting this going to be a colossal nuclear reactor with nuclear power plant with 10 reactors, they put it right in the middle of the swamp. So this forester, and a lot of the other parts of the swamp were dried up for agriculture and to make room for the plant. But there was one section of it that was not dried up, was sort of left preserved, and it was called the Olmani Swamp. It's in southern Belarus, and I went to take a look at it. And the reason why it wasn't ameliorated or drained is because it was an Air Force bombing range for the Soviet Air Force. So I went there and, we looked around, we found a lot of, sort of spent ordnance. And there wasn't a whole lot else to see. There had been some villages in this swamp that had been evacuated when they decided that they were going to make it a bombing range. And so we saw some old graveyards were left. We're standing around looking, and I noticed this bomb crater. And from the bomb crater, there's some trees growing, some pine trees. And I just take a closer look at the pine tree, and I see these weird mutations. Pine needles are they're all supposed to grow in the same direction. But these pine needles were just what biologists would call disorganized. They were sort of going in all different directions, and some of them were even curling in rounds. Now, a couple of things can cause mutation in pine trees, but radiation is a very good candidate. So I asked the forester, I was like, how old do you think these trees are? And he said, about 40 years. And I said, so from before Chernobyl? And he goes, yeah, from before Chernobyl. And he looked a little perturbed by that fact. And so I placed this photo of this funny-looking pine needle in a file I had with unverified accounts of the Soviets of testing small strategic nuclear weapons in that Air Force bombing range in the 1960s. I couldn't find archival confirmation of these tests because the Soviet nuclear weapons development archives are off limits to researchers, specifically researchers like me. And that's the nature of state power. It can make the past, at least as it's constituted in archives, go away if it so deems. But I had other evidence that pointed to peculiar exposures in the marshes of Chernobyl. In the 1960s, a team of Soviet nuclear emergency scientists carried out a 4-year study in this same Olmani swamp. And they found that there radioactive cesium in soils, in plants, and in animals. And they found 10 to 30 times more cesium in bodies of villagers living near that swamp than in bodies of people living in nearby Minsk and Kiev. And so this is Chernobyl's area's first radiation map that was charted out in 1965, 5 years before they even broke ground on the nuclear power plant. And I think that's a pretty fascinating document. And looking at it, I thought more generally about the perforations of radioactive isotopes into organisms of the swamp long predated the day of the Chernobyl explosion in 1986. And with that, I understood that Chernobyl, rather than a one-off accident, might better be conceived of as an acceleration, a term coined by the environmental historian John McNeill. Now, the reason that is important is that if Chernobyl is an accident, then it's a discrete event with a clear beginning and a clear end. But seeing Chernobyl as a point of acceleration on a timeline of destruction, I began to visualize a much larger succession of events that are ongoing and in flux, a set of occurrences that shape the present and the future as I try to write about them. And that made for a difficult job of measuring, especially time and scale, to try to calibrate cause and effect of this accident, and that's what historians do. Chernobyl made for an especially slippery historical subject because of these problems. Take time, for instance. Physicists have been saying for over 100 years that time is a human construct, as we tick it off on clocks and calendars, that actually time expands and contracts in unpredictable ways. And I think Chernobyl brings that insight into sharp focus. People and animals exposed to Chernobyl fallout experienced a rapid radiation aging. 45-year-olds would have the organs that were the organs of an 80-year-old. For them, time sped up. But then meanwhile, if you went to other parts of the Chernobyl zone, and this is the red forest, in 1986, this pine trees got such a hit of radiation that they turned red. That's why they got the name red forest, and they died. Foresters came in and they chopped down the trees. Now here's a photograph of those trees 25 years later. What's wrong with this photograph? Pine is a soft wood. These trees should have turned to dust long before. But because of the radiation, the insects and the microbes that do the job of decomposition weren't there. So if Rumpelstiltskin had fallen asleep in the red forest and woken up 25 years later, he wouldn't have known how much time had passed. Time had drastically slowed down in the red forest. And then there's a matter of scale. Spill 1,000 Curies, and the International Atomic Energy Agency calls it a level 5 nuclear emergency, like that's happened in Brazil in 1987. Spill 900,000 times more Curies, as in Chernobyl, and the International Atomic Energy Agency scales it at not 5, but 7. Now, for physicists, this difference between 5 and 7 means a great deal, but for lay people, it doesn't seem like much of a difference. And the Chernobyl records show that people quickly lost track of how to account for the volume of destructive energy that was spreading from the plant. And I think we see that today as scientists try to grapple with the planetary scope of climate change. That scaling up of catastrophe can be paralyzing. So these problems of time and scale led me to continue to search for ways other than texts and numbers to understand Chernobyl as a political, economic, and environmental event. So I called up the only 2 biologists I could find who work regularly in the Chernobyl zone and use it as an experimental site. And they were kind enough to let me follow them as they went on their twice annual June and September trips into the zone, Tim Musso and Anders Moeller. And I learned a lot from these 2 biologists. Most often you hear that nature in the Chernobyl zone is thriving. Has anyone heard that story? It's an annual story, happens every April with the anniversary of the accident. And this is, like a lot of editors send their, go get that story about thriving nature in the Chernobyl zone. And if you can't see, and I saw only one, I used to live on Rock Creek Park in Washington, D.C. I saw a deer every day. I didn't see any in the Chernobyl zone all the time I was there. And if you need to get that story, they have a couple of caged animals for the photographers to grab that photo. But that's a very simple story that's created by journalists who make these quick flyby trips into the Chernobyl zone. But the biologists taught me that there was no singular zone of radioactivity, that there was a patchy mosaic with radiation levels differing by 4 orders of magnitude. They taught me about the interconnections of the ecosystem. They documented a decline in pollinators that led to a loss of frugivores, or fruit-eating birds. With less fruit and fewer birds, seeds did not spread. They counted all of 3 new fruit trees seeded after 1986. They basically documented a cascade of extinction. Every rock we turn over, Musso said, we find damage. In 2017, I woke up one morning, they said, well, today we're going to go to the Chernobyl zone. Now, I had hoped to not ever have to go to the Chernobyl zone, but I had, said, well, if you guys are going, I'll go with you. And the Chernobyl zone is not a pretty forest. You see these, big, this is the kind of mutations I saw in that bombing range, but on a grand scale. This tree was a commercial pine planted to grow board straight and for commercial lumber, and you see this tree did not get that message. These are also pine trees, but they've only managed to become shrubs. And you see this sort of lack of ground cover. But what I didn't expect to find, I expected there to be about 50 microsieverts of radioactivity an hour. That was already plenty. But my Geiger counter was going crazy. It was almost reaching a milli. 994 microsieverts. And I asked, Tim Mousseau, like, well, what's going on? He goes, oh, yeah. Like a couple months ago, we had a forest here, a fire here in the red forest, and that volatilized all the radioactivity buried in the leaf litter and in the dead branches, and it created a new nuclear event. So that was interesting for me. When I got out, I looked, there was no press coverage about this new nuclear event. The International Atomic Energy Agency did not scale it. And I think that's the problem with long radioactive half-lives. It's the same as with chemical toxins, that the time scales stretch beyond the capacity of social memory and human attention. So if that crooked tree in the swamp showed how radiation predated Chernobyl, the red forest showed how radiation events continued long after it. And it was this ongoing quality of the accident that plagued Soviet leaders. As much as they tried, they could not close the chapter on Chernobyl. Finally, in 1990, admitting that the biological load was too much, leaders in Ukraine and Belarus announced plans to resettle 200,000 more people from the greater Chernobyl zone, outside of the closed area. But before most of these new rounds of evacuations occurred, the Soviet Union collapsed and money and political will ran out for resettlement. And as that happened, UN agencies took over managing the disaster. They asserted that resettlement wasn't necessary. They said doses were too low. Like, compare these doses to Chernobyl, to Hiroshima, and there are studies of atomic bomb survivors, and comparatively, we don't see a problem. Pressured by UN officials, delegates voted down Chernobyl aid in the form of $1 billion in what would be today's money for both resettlement and to carry out a long-term health study of Chernobyl survivors. So I just want you to know there has been no long-term health study of medical effects from Chernobyl survivors. So when people make pronouncements, they don't have a study from which to make those pronouncements. Now, as the Soviet crisis deepened, subsidies for clean food and medical monitoring withered. The neoliberal orientation of post-Soviet Ukraine and Belarus in the later 90s made it easier ideologically to abandon people to their own fate on contaminated ground. And I think we see this globally as more and more people live in environments saturated with toxins. We see that risk has been privatized. Now, the constriction of the social welfare state and the planet in a state of ecological stress is a correlation. Whether there is a connection, a cause and effect, I think that's a question scholars in the humanities should not leave to scientists alone to answer. So as commentators in the West announced the end of history in the 1990s, the people on Chernobyl contaminated ground were left to carry on alone. They ate what they produced, having few other options, and there were few doctors to monitor their health because the doctors were some of the first people to leave these areas. In one of the few studies of Chernobyl birth defects, Vladimir Verdelecki found 6 times more cases of neurotube birth defects, that's spinal bifida and babies, anencephalic babies, in the Chernobyl areas than in the European norm. And Verdelecki has shown that the swamp dwellers had far more cesium in their bodies than other people in the rest of Ukraine. Now, this jump in birth defects could have been caused from Chernobyl. It could be from Chernobyl and nitrates from farm fertilizers, or from Chernobyl and pre-1986 Chernobyl radiation, exposures from that bombing range. My tour through the Pripyat marshes showed that these living laboratories that these scientists I followed studied were pitted with deposits of spent ammunition, heavy metals, chemical toxins, and radioactive waste distributed at a frenetic pace in the course of the 20th century. Now, you might respond to this information by feeling empathy for those people out there in northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, a discrete part of the world that's not here. And that's how I was trained to think of history, as something that plays out largely inside national borders. But now we have an awareness of the planetary scale of human actions, a cognizance that diminishes the importance of national boundaries. Those events out there make it home to us. And let me give you one last illustration before I close up about what I mean by that. Traveling in northern Ukraine during the summers I was working on this book, I found thousands of people harvesting wild blueberries from the forests around the Pripyat marshes. And pickers would come out, they were mostly women and children, and they would sell to buyers who would park on the forested roads. And I asked a buyer, how many of these berries do you buy a day? And she said 2 tons a day, and there were hundreds of these vans parked there. So Olya and I, we went undercover blueberry picking, and we went into the forest, we picked some berries. Here I am, I've just sold my berries to the buyer, and I'm looking pretty clever. And then we followed the buyers to the wholesale market, this big warehouse, where this nice lady was buying berries from the van operators. But before she bought them, she monitored them, she measured them for radioactivity. So I asked her, how many of these berries are radioactive? And she looked at me like I was stupid, and she goes, all the berries are radioactive. She goes, but some are really radioactive, like 3,000 becquerels a kilogram. Now, the norm for Ukraine at the time was 450 becquerels a kilogram. Now, we stood around and watched her buy berries, and our berries were under the norm, but a lot of berries were over the norm. But she still bought the berries. And so I asked, what is she going to do with those berries that are above the norm? And the pickers told me, it's like the sausage. You mix together the clean berries with the cleaner berries with the dirtier berries, and you get to the European Union norm, which is 1,250 becquerels a kilogram. And then those berries can go over to the border to Poland to be distributed into the EU markets. Okay, it's still not in North America, but I found a Homeland Security report about a truck crossing the border between Canada into the US. And the Homeland Security report said that there was a radioactive mass in the van. So I called up that Homeland Security agent. I said, what was in that truck? He goes, oh, those were berries from Ukraine. So now those berries are a lot closer to our breakfast plates. And so that's my, I think this point underlines what I found, is that the Chernobyl accident serves as an exclamation point in a chain of toxic exposures that have remastered landscapes, societies, politics, and bodies, including our own bodies. Describing Chernobyl as an accident is a broom that sweeps away this larger story around it, which I think is a more important story. One reason there's been so little research on Chernobyl health effects is that scientists and funding agencies threw up their hands in confusion and walked away at the toxic complexity of the layers of contaminants in these environments. But another reason for the paucity of research I found working my way through 5 UN agency archives is that UN agents work to cover up the story of a public health disaster. I found them hiding biopsies of cancer patients, burying data, slandering and discrediting opposing scientists. And once I published my book, these industry scientists started slandering me. Now, you might ask, why would UN agencies do that? But I found that UN officials serve their client states, and their biggest clients are the nuclear powers: United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia, China. And these countries, minus China, were on the line in the 1990s for billions of dollars in liability as a record of Cold War weapons development and testing was gradually declassified. Now, if international scientists could devise a narrative that Chernobyl was the world's worst nuclear disaster and only 54 people died, well, we could live with those risks. We could live with those margins. And that's where the accident narrative was useful. See Chernobyl as a one-off disaster, and the liabilities, the cost of cleanup, the ongoing public health emergency dissolves. It's a different story to see Chernobyl as an acceleration in a half century in which the Soviet Union and the United States alone released not 45 million curies of radioactive iodine. That's a pernicious isotope that goes to the thyroid, causes thyroid cancer and thyroid disease and a host of other health problems. But not 45 million, but 20 billion curies of radioactive iodine. Now, America is kind of unique. Most people tested nuclear weapons in some colonial other place, France and Algeria in the South Pacific, the British in the South Pacific, the Russians in Kazakhstan in the polar north. But the Americans tested in the South Pacific too, but also in Nevada, continental United States. And here's a map. You see ground zero where Nevada is, but you also see these brown spots, as hot as that got at ground zero in the heartland where Minnesota wheat and corn and a lot of the American breadbasket is, and as far away as Rochester. Now, part of the reason you see it up there in upstate New York is because Rochester had the Kodak labs, and Kodak had very sensitive equipment to monitor radiation. I assume that had there been other sensitive detective devices, we'd have bigger brown spots in other places. And here's another visualization of that radioactive iodine doses. Now, we see a lot of, the Keeling curve, right? Atmospheric CO2. But we have a lot of other similar hockey puck sticks that come with public health. And these are the rates of cancers that have been climbing since 1952, since the big years of nuclear testing. Cancer rates for people born after 1952 are steadily on the rise. Thyroid cancers are off the charts. Nobody can really understand why. But other things like male sperm counts have dropped in half since 1945. These are the kinds of images of the Anthropocene that I think we should be thinking about. So let me just leave you with this one last photograph. I want you to take I met this girl. She has blue lips. She's a berry picker. Her lips are blue because she, picks some berries and she puts some in her basket. But I hope you see how she is also a nuclear waste worker, like the soldiers on the other half of the photograph. She's there to make a living on the toxic detritus left behind by others. But also maybe there's another way to think about this. Those berries and the mushrooms and cranberries they go back to pick later in the season are doing the work of what an army of Soviet and international scientists did not manage to accomplish. They are cleaning up radioactive isotopes from soils and plants in these environments. So we could think of this another way. Rather than seeing these blueberries as produce to circle global markets, we could think of them as our allies in a big toxic cleanup project. We could pay these swamp dwellers $25 a day, what they make selling their berries, and pay them to deposit those berries in a nuclear waste repository. Maybe the disaster tourists who flocked to the Chernobyl zone before the war. There were lots of people having stag parties, all kinds of unbelievable things go on in the Chernobyl zone among the tourists, but maybe they would pay to pick radioactive berries and take a selfie of themselves eating one, and then they could deposit it as radioactive waste in a nuclear depository. I just think it takes looking at our environmental problems with our eyes wide open, and then I think we can picture a brave new world. Thank you.
Our thanks to Professor Brown for that fantastic talk. We have time for some questions and answers. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and either myself, I'm Sylvia Sellers-Garcia, the director of the Lowell Humanities Series, or Avi Goldstein, the assistant director, will walk to you with the mic, and that way we can all hear your question.
Thank you, Professor Brown. I think I would like to ask the question on everyone's lips. If we go in the slides all the way back to the beginning, to the story about the, I guess, Soviet bombers manipulating the weather and making it rain. I would love some more detailed explanation on that. That sounds like a really cool story. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, weather manipulation is something that was a Cold War science. The Soviets worked on it. The Americans worked on it. It was possibly a weapon of war. You can make it rain on somebody else's country or have a drought on somebody else's country. The Soviets famously used weather manipulation to have sunny, their big national holidays, November, rainy, cold, and in the early spring, rainy, cold. Every time I ever marched in a big Soviet holiday parade, it was always sunny in Moscow in November. So they, this was something that they did. So they had these pilots. They had, they seeded the clouds with kind of like cement, like little particles of cement, which then drew the moisture around them. The moisture circulated around them, kind of like all the rain we got this summer, which was a lot of it was caused by the Canadian fires and all the soot in the air from that. And then the rain just, they injected so much into it, the rain just came down on rural Belarus. Now the Ukrainians did something different. They went and they wanted to stop the rain in their country. So they had a project where they followed the clouds that were flying around Ukraine, and they seeded the clouds so that it did not rain. It evaporated, and so that rain went somewhere else. It might have gone to southern Germany or to Sweden, but it didn't rain on Ukraine. Now the pilots who did this, they flew through these radioactive clouds. And so a lot of them were all messed up from the waist down. Lost their legs, lost fertility, cancers, all that kind of thing. But the story broke in 2004 when Putin gave them a big medal awarding them. And that's when we learned about it.
So I have another question. I guess my question would be, how did the fall of the Soviet Union impact the amount of sources available to you? So I imagine that, I noticed that you said that the Soviet Union, the sources weren't super reliable, or they weren't very weren't a lot of sources. Is modern day Russia also more open with the amount of data, the limited, I imagine, amount of data available at all, if you know?
Yeah. So the collapse of the Soviet Union was a boon for Soviet researchers. We suddenly got into archives that we never dreamed we would ever get into. And so I went to Ukraine. I think the first time I started working on this project was 2014. And I walked into the archive where I'd worked before in the past, and I asked the archivists for records of the Soviet, medical consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. And the archivists, they laughed at me. They said, it was a closed society. That was a banned topic. You're not going to find anything. But I knew these archivists. As I said, I'd worked there before, and I knew they didn't like to get off their stools. So I said, well, let's just take a look. And within a couple of minutes, it didn't take a good sleuth, we found whole volumes, bound volumes with the title, The Medical Consequences of the Chernobyl Disaster. And I looked at them, and they looked at me kind of sheepishly. And what I realized when I opened the volumes is that researchers have to sign their names. I was the first person to ever request these volumes, which is why the archivists didn't know they existed. Now that's an astounding fact, that there wasn't any curiosity. And so there was no paucity of records. It was a Klondike of records everywhere we turned. Just pouring out. The Belarusian Academy of Sciences, to my great surprise, set up case control studies from the summer of 1986. They started monitoring children. They started monitoring adults. All these studies were sitting in archives in Minsk. They had tried to get UN scientists interested in their studies, and UN scientists said, you Soviets don't know how to do, you don't have standard Western protocols, you don't know how to do science, you had crappy economy, you had crappy politics, you have crappy, technology. Look at Chernobyl, you have crappy medicine. And so all of these studies were dismissed, but they were sitting there. So over and over again, I found, just fascinating materials. Ukraine is one of the few post-Soviet countries that have opened their KGB archives. KGB had a science and technology wing to it. So these KGB officers were interesting people because they were able to enter any organization, to go to any person and start asking them questions. And so they were all over the place. Actually we think of, KGB agents as these pernicious people that are destroying people's lives, and they certainly did that. But they also were there, they were the ones who got the radioactive train full of meat and said, this is insane that it's sitting here in this yard in the middle of a town where it's gamma rays are hitting people, and they moved it into the Chernobyl zone. So their archives were really fascinating. So the fall of the Soviet Union was really very helpful.
Hello, I have two questions. First one is, maybe you heard recent news that Russia is making its way to ratify anti-nuclear test treaty. And as I heard today, they made their first nuclear tests in some polygon. Can you please share your opinion about it?
That's terrible news. I didn't know that. There's no reason anymore to do to test a nuclear weapon. They have computer simulations that the nuclear weapons designers say work really well. They can test the materials to make sure the materials will still work. So if you're concerned about one's country's nuclear shield, you don't need to test nuclear weapons. Even if you test them below ground, did they test them above ground or below?
I think it was on the ground, like...
Underground.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even underground, these things sort of belch out radioactivity. Not as bad as testing them above ground. But what that is, it's a threatening action. It doesn't serve any scientific purpose. It's just politics.
Thank you. And also one more question. Do you think that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant can become one more catastrophe like Chernobyl in a few years?
Zaporizhzhia?
Zaporizhzhia power plant.
I'm really worried about that plant. There's big battles being fought over it. As I said, the containment structures cannot take a direct hit from a missile or heavy artillery. But even more troubling is that they have decades of spent fuel that are stored in pools and basins. Those pools need to have electricity going to them. They need to have pumps working so that the water evaporates, new water has to go in there. They need to stay underwater and they need to stay cool. They're self-heating at hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit. So you don't even need to attack that nuclear power plant or any of the nuclear power plants in Ukraine. Ukraine's a big nuclear power in Europe. You just need to cut electricity to it for more than a couple of weeks, and we would have something that made Chernobyl look like a picnic.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming to this lecture, and I just want to say I've learned so much from the lecture, and in reading your book, it really stood out to me, all the sources you'd compiled and like the time and determination it probably took, and especially like getting those classified documents that stood out to me. And my question was, in like going to Ozersk and talking to people about their personal experiences, you brought up this term disaster tourist and how like people sometimes thought that you might have been a disaster tourist, and I was wondering, like in your process, in talking to them, how you gained their trust, and just like what your process was like in interviewing people. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think my method was very good. When I was you're talking about an earlier book I wrote called Plutopia, where I had to go to the Siberia, to the Urals, the southern Russian Urals. And when I was working on that book, I had a small child at home, and so I would make these short trips, like 3-week trips at a time, 3 weeks at a time, and I was quickly trying to get all the information I could. So I would go, I basically, in so many words, go up to people who had worked at this plant or had been an exposed neighbor of this plutonium plant, and I would put a microphone in their face and say, tell me your problems, tell me your trauma. I was calling myself a disaster tourist, I think, for very serious reasons. I mean, at one point, I was with this woman at her house. She lived in very radioactive territory, and she served me and this human rights lawyer I was traveling with a meal, and neither of us ate the meal. And that, you cook a meal, it's offensive if somebody doesn't eat your meal. I could have taken a few bites, right? I mean, I would have. Certainly her food was radioactive, but I could have had that kind of, exposure and made her feel better, but I didn't. And she got mad and said, told the story as an allegory for me to learn about the Soviet health inspectors who would come, sit down, they'd put little plastic bags down in the chair, before they sat on it, and they would bring their own bottles of water, and they would not eat her food. And she also said they would go away and do nothing to help us. And I got the feeling she was suspecting of that of me. And as I left, she asked me for money. She asked me for, kind of a lot of money by their standards, like a couple $100s. And, as a researcher, you're not supposed to pay for interviews. But I gave her money because I realized she was basically saying, you've been I've been your guide in this disaster tour. And for that, one needs to pay their guide. And from that moment on, I started thinking about, the extractive nature of my methodology. So now I would do it differently. And I don't have my small child is now 23-year-old, so I don't have to worry about getting home so fast. But now I would spend a lot more time in the community. I would probably find something constructive to do so that I could give back to that community, and I would hang out a lot longer.
I think we have time for just one more question.
There's somebody up here in the front, Sylvia.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture, and a lecture that has made me think a lot about reading Voices of Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich. And I wondered, I assume you have read it, and I wonder to what extent it inspired or guided some of your interactions with people and finding out that it's the voices of the people who are on the ground, as it were, who are the best guides.
Yeah. Alexievich, there's a lesser well-known, but in Belarus well-known novelist, Ales Adamovich, and he had this practice, and Alexievich was a student at the time and went along, and they would go out into the countryside and they would take oral histories, mostly of World War II, and sort of surviving the Holocaust and surviving the German occupation. So she learned her methods in that way. I read Voices of Chernobyl, but I didn't cite it because what she does is as she talks about in her preface, is she takes lots of different interviews and then she puts them together as composite characters. So I didn't know. I mean, I didn't see that as I thought. She says what she writes is literature. So I didn't see that as a nonfiction source. And I think she really amps up the tragedy and the trauma. And I don't know. I found that a little bit too much.
Thank you all so much for coming to this talk. We have copies of Professor Brown's book for sale in the rotunda. If you have a book or would like to buy a book and have it signed, would you please line up on this side of the wall under the portraits, and Professor Brown will sign your book up here at the front. Thanks again so much for coming. Please join me in thanking her.